Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Another day. Let's start with some meditation. And for this class, I'm not going to guide you for these first 5 minutes of meditation, but do remember to, of course, set up your posture and calm your mind, and also include a positive motivation for participating in this activity. Okay, welcome everyone. And yeah, welcome back for those of you who did the last course, and welcome to any new people who are joining us. It's amazing, 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 amazing that you are here. Wow, wow, wow. That we have this opportunity to learn and practice together, even though we're all stuck in our own homes. Kind of an amazing thing. When I was a kid, this idea of video conferencing was science fiction. You know, it was, and cell phones were science fiction too. Star Trek and the Jetsons. So it's amazing that we can do this now. Let's see, a couple of things about how we do this. So we're making the meditation for 5 minutes, just a time to get centered, to get you know, into your space, into your headspace of doing some Dharma, and also to set a positive motivation, because that very much influences the results of what we are creating here. So having an effect beyond just gathering knowledge or just beyond our own minds, but helping others as well, helping the world situation. And this works because of interdependence. Even very small things that we do can have lasting and far-reaching benefits. Let's see, some technical things. Felipe has muted all of you so that you don't have to worry about background noise. If you are having difficulty with receiving the audio, sometimes it's better to stop your video. So click on that stop video, and then that allows the audio to come through more clearly. And then when we get to the Q&A time, what we'll do is Felipe will ask you to type in your questions in the chat, and you click on the chat in order to even see the chat. And then write in your question, and then he'll unmute you and you can ask your question out loud, and you could stop, I mean, you could start your video again at that time, because it's nice for people to see and for me to see your face while I'm talking to you, if your bandwidth allows it. This morning we're doing something a little different. So the other aspect of chat, and Felipe, so Felipe is my meditation leader and technical support. And he's under registered Tushita. So if you see registered Tushita under the participants, that's him. So he, when you type in chat, it can only go to him. It can't go to everyone. So we just kind of limit as much as we can the chatter. And so he has sent you a file, the chart, the drive, it's under the link that says Google Drive. So if you click on that.
Does it allow you to click Venerable? I think Zoom has limited now. They changed, they updated the app, and it doesn't allow me to send files anymore. And it seems links are not linking either.
Well, it worked for me.
Good.
Okay, but I can show it too. I can share my screen and show it. It's just, it's a lot of reading. But let's start there and see how it goes, and then people can download the file later if they can't see it on their own computer.
I'm
so let's try that.
Messages that they can download it. So if they click on the link, they should be able to get it.
Yeah, they can see it too.
Yeah.
Now, if they click on the link.
Yep.
Let's see. Okay. All right, let's see. So but anyway, so I thought last week we could send a file and people could open it on their computers. So things have changed over the weekend. Zoom is becoming very popular. So I want to refer to that document in a little bit. Was there anything else I wanted to say? Felipe, do you have anything technical you want to say?
No, I think it's pretty much similar to the previous sessions that we've been doing. Maybe only the timing will be different, but that's it.
Okay, so yes, we're going to go a little longer on the teaching, but everything else will be the same. We're sort of taking out that beginning long meditation and adding more teaching. So I hope that's beneficial for you. And if not, if there are many people who would rather have longer meditation at the beginning, then please let us know in the chat, and we'll consider that. I think that's it for now. Let's go. Okay, so I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the history. So we started the last course with the life of the Buddha, but now I want to take it a little further. So the Buddha taught until he was 80 years old, which is very nice because we have lots and lots of teachings from him. And he gathered many, many followers during that time. So many disciples would come and receive teachings from him, and then they would go out into India and travel and teach and sort of spread his teachings. And like I had said before, at that time, this kind of lifestyle of being a beggar, being a wanderer, being homeless, they called it going forth. It's actually the basis of the monastic life that we have today. But this, and they would wear, you know, remnants of clothes, you know, clothes that were cast off from people who had died. And yeah, so it was an interesting lifestyle. And during the Buddha's lifetime, he also ordained women. So it was difficult for women though because of this lifestyle of being a wandering ascetic. But the first woman who asked to be ordained was actually his aunt who raised him. So she was the first nun, and it took a little bit to for her to convince him to ordain herself and her friends. And part of it was because in India that time, to become one of these wandering wise people was dangerous for women, because they were on their own, right? And there were people who were not particularly kind. And so he also, when he ordained women, he added some rules. So actually, nuns have more vows than men, not because they're not, because of the society situation. And one of the reasons, actually the final reason that he decided to ordain women was because women have just as much opportunity to become enlightened in a woman's body as men do. So there's no, at one time in Buddhist history, there was some doctrine that emerged that was not in line actually with what the Buddha originally said, that talked about that you should be born a man in order to be, or in order to get enlightened. And that isn't exactly what the Buddha said. It is a little easier, like we know even today, that it's a little easier for men to survive, right? Because of the strength, also because of the society that tends to support men. But for, at that time, what he said was, we can still do it. So there's a really good book about this if you're interested. It's called Buddhism After Patriarchy. And I don't remember the woman's name. I want to say Griffith, Susan Griffith, but Felipe will look it up for you. Buddhism After Patriarchy. It's very good book. Okay. It tracks the whole, you know, women throughout Buddhism and the different doctrines, and that's okay. So there were men and women who were practicing, who were traveling all over India. And after the Buddha passed away, so at the time, these the doctrine, the teachings were not written down in the Buddha's lifetime. Ananda, who was his attendant and also his cousin, was considered, he had a phenomenal memory, and he was the one who knew how to remember all the Buddha's teachings. And so he, the first council that they had when they started talking about, okay, now our teacher has passed away, what do we do, where do we go from here, he was called in to recount all the teachings that the Buddha had spoken. So it took a while, long time, right? And these teachings were then passed down orally, okay, by mouth. And sometimes people think, well, didn't they get changed? You know, isn't it like we don't really have access to the actual Buddha's words? And sometimes I feel like, well, even if they were written down, that doesn't mean that we have access to them. And people at that time had amazing memories because they couldn't write it down, right? So it took a while for them to write it down. Yeah, there was something else I wanted to say. Oh, yes. So just because we don't have access to the actual, necessarily, maybe we do, maybe we don't, to the exact words that the Buddha said, doesn't mean that the realizations or the insights or the actual path didn't exist in the minds of those followers and wasn't recreated in their minds um, throughout the lineage from the beginning. In fact, they talk about that is actually the Dharma. We sometimes talk about the Dharma as being the teachings of the Buddha, the books of the Buddha, what was written down, the words of the Buddha. But then there's another layer of Dharma that is actually the realizations, the understandings that are in the minds of the practitioners. And those realizations, those understandings, then if they work, right, if they remove the suffering, if they remove the ignorance, if they create positive situations for people, then this is the Dharma because they work, right? So the teachings have been passed down in this way as insights, as realizations. Okay, so so then Buddhism spread throughout India. Um, yeah, throughout India, it spread. It traveled south to throughout India. It traveled to Sri Lanka. It eventually moved over. Right now, it still exists in Burma, in Thailand, in Cambodia, in Laos. And so this is the teachings of the Buddha that were eventually written down in the Pali language. That's P-A-L-I, the Pali language. And those still exist, those texts still exist. And Pali, the language Pali, is actually a dialect of the original um, uh, language that the Buddha spoke. Okay, so the Buddha spoke in a dialect of Pali, and those were considered the earlier teachings. Okay, and the foundation. Okay, and then Buddhism also traveled north into, of course, Nepal, Pakistan before when it was still India, into China, into Japan, Korea, of course, Bhutan, and then of course Tibet. It actually traveled to China first before it got to Tibet. And then around the 11th century, the teachings died out in India. The Buddhist teachings died out in India, and they were still preserved in places like China and Japan, and like I said, Sri Lanka and those other countries. And those, so the northern teachings, before I get off my point, the northern teachings were written down in the Sanskrit language, okay, which at the time was considered the more holy language because it was the language of the Vedas, which were the holy books of India at the time. And so this Sanskrit, so we have basically two two lineages, one teacher and two lineages. We have the Pali lineage and we have the Sanskrit lineage. So the teachings that traveled to Tibet were actually in the Sanskrit language. And there were, when Buddhism was at its peak in India in around the, well, from around basically the 3rd century until the 11th century, there were huge monastic universities that studied Buddhism, and there was lots of debate, and many scholars would get together and talk about what the Buddha meant by all these teachings, and how they were much more systematized and organized at that time, because the Buddha, when he taught to many, many different audiences. He taught to, and he would teach based on what that particular audience needed. So he would teach focusing on the capacity of his listeners. So if they weren't ready for this idea of the emptiness of all things, this idea that everything is a dependent arising, that there is no concrete internal, external reality, well, then he wouldn't necessarily teach that doctrine. He would back off a little bit and talk only about some impermanence, this idea of the constantly changing nature of things, okay? So when he taught, his teachings weren't necessarily put in order in a way that when we're getting the whole teaching as a bunch, that they're easier to understand. So there were scholars who were invited to, well, first of all, there were kings in Tibet who heard about these Buddhist teachings, and they were considered, there were 3 of them, and they were called the Dharma kings. And so, of course, they were interested in Buddhism. They were trying to be practitioners, but they also recognized that their country at the time was pretty unruly. It was not, tamed very much, and bringing Buddhism to Tibet would be a big, big job. Especially they had language differences, Sanskrit and didn't exist in Tibet. Tibet had its own language. It had an oral language. So what these kings did was that they invited scholars from this one of these big monasteries called the Nalanda University, or Nalanda Monastic University, and they would bring them to Tibet to teach, to start to bring Buddhism into Tibet. And the language thing, they would also bring translators, and they would send Tibetans to India to learn as well. And so what's very interesting about the Tibetan language is that the written language was actually developed in order to translate the Sanskrit Buddhist teachings into Tibetan. And so the Tibetan language had, many terms were invented to parallel these concepts in the Sanskrit. And so when scholars today compare the Tibetan translations of the Dharma texts to the original Sanskrits, they find out that they are very much aligned, that the translation was really excellent, and not a lot was lost. Even when they compare, texts that were lost in Sanskrit that were translated to Chinese, and then they compare the Chinese and the Tibetan, even then you see lots of parallels, lots of authenticity, lots of preservation, which is actually in English is very hard to do, because English has, is already established as a very, rich language with lots. And that's why whenever I teach, and I teach in English, I have many, many English words to describe, one concept. It would be one word in Tibetan, and yet it's many, many, which is positive in many ways, because it's makes the meaning very rich, but it also makes it kind of difficult in some ways, because because it's hard to learn, especially if English is not your native language. Okay, so these teachings traveled to Tibet, and they were systematized in many ways in order to be communicated to the Tibetan people. The Tibetans actually took many of the what are considered more foundational teachings, and they said, okay, these are the early teachings, these are the more basic teachings, and then you have to build on these. So another thing that happened in the history of Buddhism is that there were certain teachings that the Buddha would give publicly, that he would teach to anyone who he felt was ready, which was, you know, in general. So they had these general teachings, like the Four Noble Truths is considered one of the general teachings. And then he taught more in secret the Mahayana, which we'll talk about when we get to this. You can look at the chart now. Let's do that. So like I said, it's a lot of reading, and if you can download it, it's better. Or if you came to a course and you still have this sheet, that would be great. So you can see under the vehicle. So vehicle means the way in which you get somewhere, right? You use a car, you use a taxi, you use a, you know, a train or whatever, that's your vehicle. So when we talk about Theravada or the Pali or that tradition that traveled south, we're talking about this more basic vehicle, this foundational vehicle, and was written down in this Pali language. And then we talk about the Mahayana vehicle, which is considered, Mahayana means greater and yana means vehicle. And that was what was written down in Sanskrit. So this Mahayana vehicle that was taught first by the Buddha in secret emerged as more popular around the, yeah, I don't know about my dates. I want to say about 500 years after the Buddha died. So that would have been about 100 BCE. I'm not sure about my dates, so don't quote me on that. But this vehicle of the Bodhisattva or the Bodhicitta became more popular within this Sanskrit, within this Mahayana, and also this doctrine of emptiness that takes one beyond selflessness. So you can see all the way over in the last column under the Vipassana, which is another word for wisdom column. In the Theravada or the foundation vehicle, you have that impermanence, suffering, and no self were taught. But it's only when we get to the Mahayana vehicle that you see that emptiness is more taught, in terms of not only emptiness of the self, but also emptiness of all phenomena. Okay, so this became more popular later after the Buddha passed away. And there's some other differences that we're going to talk about in a minute. So then after that, the third vehicle, and so about 200 years later, this was also taught by the Buddha according to the tradition and the lineage, that the Buddha also taught the tantric teachings, or what we call the Vajrayana. Vajra meaning like diamond or indestructible, and yana meaning vehicle. And so these tantra teachings, or sometimes it's called the mantrayana, these became more popular around, like I said, the 1st century CE. And because when they weren't really, people weren't ready to actually get these teachings because of the danger in them. And we'll talk more about that when we get more into Tantra towards the end of the course. But yeah, I don't think I want to go into that right now. Just so you know, it's more, and even today, it's considered more of a secret teaching. And you won't necessarily get a lot of teachings on Tantra within Buddhist schools until you go through a certain number of prerequisites or a certain number of, you know, vetting by the lamas. Sometimes you can get empowerments, but when you start talking about commentaries and how to actually practice Tantra within the Buddhist schools, it's less accessible. So the more that you practice, the more that you connect with the teacher, the more that you attend teachings, the more that you will start to get exposure to this Tantra vehicle. Okay, so before we go to that, let me come back to talking a little bit more about the spread of Buddhism in Tibet. So Buddhism died out in India around the 11th century. The first scholars that were coming to Tibet from India were in about the 8th century. And Padmasambhava, you may have heard of. Guru Rinpoche is another word for Padmasambhava. He was one of the first who brought Buddhism to Tibet. Shantarakshita was another one. He established the first monastery in Tibet. And it was King, no, I don't know. I want to say Songtsen Gampo that brought those first, and then it was Trisang Detsen, but I'm not sure the names matter. There's a really good book called The History of Buddhism that you can read all this about, and it covers all the schools, not just Tibetan Buddhism. But anyway, it was one of the Dharma kings who brought them there. They had a little resistance when they first tried to establish Buddhism in Tibet. And Padmasambhava was brought in as a very powerful tantric master who was able to subdue the obstacles that were happening, and you know, get a lot of people over to his side. And then so then Buddhism was started to be established, like I said, in the 8th century, and then it died out. There was another king who came along who wasn't all that into it, and tried to suppress it and kill the followers of Buddhism. And then another king who showed up and said, no, we really want Buddhism, and he brought some more Tibetans, and this we have Atisha. So Atisha is was the 11th century teacher who becomes the foundation of what they call the new schools. Okay, so let me see if I can do this. I'm just going to list them. I'm not going to try to write them. I'll write them up later if you want me to. So the old school that still exists, that was established by Padmasambhava, is considered the first wave of Buddhism, and that's the Nyingma school. Okay, and then later, after Atisha and what stems from Tisha are considered the newer schools, and we have the Sakya, the Kagyu, and the Geluk. So the newest one is the Gelugpa school, and that's the school that I am teaching you from, is the Gelugpa school. And the founder of Gelugpa school is this particular gentleman who is really big behind me up here. That's Lama Tsongkhapa. And he showed up around the 14th century. So Buddhism spread, was established, was practiced for a long time, and it started to die out in other countries, and was suppressed. This wave of communism came through in China very much. It was destroyed, and they destroyed it in many ways in Tibet. And when His Holiness fled his country in 1959, Buddhism was only, I mean, it exists now as a whole system, including all the three vehicles. It was preserved in Tibet, you know, and now I think Nepal and Bhutan are the only places that it still is practiced in its entirety. This Sanskrit tradition. I'm trying to think. Mongolia. I think those three. Yeah. Yeah, Mongolia, Nepal, and Bhutan. So when His Holiness left Tibet, his first important thing, that he, one of his main things was to preserve this incredible cultural as well as system of thinking that is Buddhism, that existed and was preserved in its entirety in Tibet. And so then he supported all these lamas to start teaching, to continue practicing, even in the refugee camps. The lamas were encouraged to now mingle the four schools, to continue to have debates. He set up monasteries, which still exist now in the south of India, and established in, of course, Bhutan and Nepal. And so the reason why we even have the Tibetan tradition here in India, and then now getting established more in many countries of the West, were because of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that he encouraged his lamas to go out and teach, and not, Tibet for a long time was a very closed country. It was very, did not want any foreigners in it, and would even, there's a great story of a woman who would disguise herself as a Tibetan man in order to travel through Tibet in the early, like 1930s and 1940s. So Nielsen, I can't remember the name. Okay, so anyway, so the reason why we have this whole tradition that I'm going to present to you is because His Holiness wanted it preserved and wanted it taught. Okay. All right, so let's go back to, lost some power here. So let's go back to this 3 vehicles, and I'll go over that some more. Okay, so we have the Theravada, which is actually one of those early foundational schools. And we just used Theravada because the term that it was, term that was used, Hinayana, you may have heard of, was considered lower school, that is, and has some kind of negative connotation, that Hinayana is somehow lower. But in English, a nice translation instead of Theravada is foundation school. Okay, so within the foundation school, we have the aspiration of renunciation, which we're going to talk about a little bit more today. We have the goal of nirvana, which you can see that the goal of nirvana, also known as liberation, is different from enlightenment. Okay, so we're going to make a distinction between those two. And then the practices that we talked about last class: ethics, concentration, and wisdom. So those 8-fold path can be divided into those 3: ethics, concentration, and wisdom. And then the wisdom that we talked about a lot last course was impermanence. We talked about suffering, and we actually skipped right to emptiness. We didn't do the no self. We're going to do the no self here, because I feel like actually for modern people who have a modern education, that emptiness is actually easier to understand than selflessness. Okay, just for now. All right, so then the Mahayana vehicle, like I said, developed later, have this aspiration of bodhicitta. A bodhisattva is someone who has this realization of bodhicitta. Okay, so bodhicitta is this wish, and a bodhisattva is someone who has the wish and then enacts it or engages in it. And their goal is enlightenment, becoming a full Buddha. And then the practices include the ethics, concentration, and wisdom, but they also include some other things in relation to others: generosity, patience, joyous effort. Okay. And then the emptiness or shunyata is the same as for the Vajrayana school. So then the Tantric school, we have the same aspiration, bodhicitta. We have the same goal, enlightenment. We have a little bit of different practices, and we'll talk a little bit about those at the end of the course: generation and completion, but the emptiness is the same. So in order to practice Tantra, or in order to practice this Vajrayana, one actually has to have a basis within this Theravada and Mahayana both. Okay, so the difference, let's talk about the difference between nirvana and enlightenment. So at the bottom, you'll see some definitions there. Okay, so we have the first definition: renunciation is the mind that is intent on liberation from samsara. So samsara is a word for the experience of all ordinary beings. So sometimes we think of samsara as a place, but it isn't actually a place. It's actually a state of mind, a mind that interacts with the world based on ignorance. So liberation from samsara is getting free of that ignorance. And renunciation is this commitment that you want to be free from that ignorance, which of course would shift your whole world. Okay, so in some ways it would be, oh, then you're in a different place. See what I mean? If you have a different view, maybe you have a different place. Okay, now enlightenment, so nirvana then becomes freedom from the afflictive obscurations. And the afflictive obscurations you see are ignorance and the seeds of ignorance. So nirvana is this liberation from samsara, this freedom from the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death over and over and over again. Okay, and that's what the Four Noble Truths in particular talk about, this idea of cessation and how to get to the cessation. And then enlightenment is actually goes further. Enlightenment not only removes the afflictive, the ignorance and the seeds of ignorance, but it also removes the cognitive obscurations, which are the stains or the latency of ignorance and the mistaken dualistic appearance that arises due to those stains. So as a result of removing one's cognitive obscurations, one achieves full enlightenment, becoming a Buddha, not simply liberated. First, one gets liberation from samsara, and then one achieves Buddhahood, which is omniscience, okay? Able to know everything. And a Buddha, because they know everything, are also able to benefit sentient beings with whatever they need, okay? And this it doesn't include all powerful, okay? So it's not like the sense of a creator God, okay? It is all knowing, but not all powerful, okay? And it is beyond simply liberation. Now it becomes omniscience, okay? And then shamatha is calm abiding, vipassana is special insight. So we're making a distinction between getting free from samsara, free from this ignorance, and becoming fully enlightened, becoming a Buddha. So in the Theravada tradition, in the foundation school, the understanding was that Shakyamuni Buddha, when he came to this world, after he passed away, he went into nirvana and out of existence. Okay, with the emergence of this Mahayana school, we have a different view of what a Buddha is, what an enlightened being is. We come to the view that a Buddha, even after they have achieved nirvana and enlightenment, are still present in the world and able to benefit sentient beings. Okay, we can't necessarily see them. We don't know when they are present for us necessarily. We may sometimes have visions, have insights, but in general, they benefit us whenever we create the causes for them to be able to benefit us, but we don't necessarily see them, but they are always present. Okay, so the difference between a Buddha whose teachings are still present and benefiting, but themselves have passed away, and the presence of an enlightened being is enlightenment versus nirvana. Okay, so then the Vajrayana, the Tantra vehicle is considered a faster vehicle. It's considered faster in the sense that doing these techniques, one can achieve enlightenment through the Mahayana vehicle, but it takes much longer. And the Vajrayana or Tantric vehicle is considered much quicker. Okay, so sentient beings are suffering. We have this bodhicitta motivation, wishing them to be free from suffering as quickly as possible. And so we want to take the quickest path possible. Okay. All right, so a little more history. How am I doing on time? No, I think we're okay. I think we're okay. I always have more to say than I ever have time. Even when I have all this time, all right. It's crazy. Okay, so let's look at some slides. So Lama Tsongkhapa, who's behind me up here, 14th century Tibetan. So 1397, is that right? 1397 to 1419? No, that's not right. Anyway, late 13th, early 1400s is when he lived. And he reformed Buddhism in many ways. He revitalized it. He united much of Tibet under Buddhism. He was an amazing scholar and practitioner. He studied with the Sakya and the Kagyu and the Nyingma. And he was a yogi. He did, he's renowned for many practices that he did, like, millions of mandala offerings and prostrations. And he established in Tibet, which still continues today, the great Monlam festival, which is a prayer festival that happens around the New Year every year. He also, he felt like the monastics within the tradition were starting to get a little loose, and so he really sort of got very clear about the Vinaya, which are the vows of the monastics, and made them very sort of, made people more obedient to them, got more strict. Maybe that's better. He reformed monasticism in many ways. And as a result, you will see more formal monastics within the school that he established, the Scalupa school. So another thing that he did was he wrote commentaries, so on the Buddha's teachings, and he combined all those three vehicles that we have been talking about, and he put it into one system, okay, called the Lam Rim. Okay, Lam means path and Rim means stages. So stages on the path to enlightenment. Okay, and he talks about these three sort of stages. And the first stage is beings of what he called small capacity. So, and it doesn't mean that you're born into this capacity and then you can't change. It usually has more to do with, in our lives, sometimes we're more focused on certain goals or on certain aspects of the teachings. And it's important to us to broaden our capacity. And we can do that in one lifetime. We can broaden our capacity. So the small capacity has a goal of a better future life. And the main aspiration then is renunciation. So creating the conditions to us to be born in a better future life. And they say if you're only concerned about this life, then you aren't necessarily considered a Buddhist, which is an interesting to think about. So you should really check that. Can you be a Buddhist and not be motivated toward future lives? That's always a big question. So something you get to figure out in your own mind. So a better future life, renunciation. Someone of medium capacity, liberation from samsara is the goal. Emptiness is the main practice. Okay, what we talked about, the dependent arising and emptiness. And then someone of great capacity, enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. And bodhicitta, this motivation to become enlightened in order to benefit all beings. Okay. So we have this whole path that Lama Tsongkhapa outlined for us, and the books that he wrote that describe this most deeply are called the Lamrim Chenmo. great stages on the path to enlightenment. And he, in it, so it's been translated into English, and it's in 3 volumes, and you can get it. It's on Kindle, and it's great for reference in particular. If you're ever looking for, you know, specifics about any practice, if you ever want to read more on shamatha or read more on emptiness, you know, it's all in there. Okay, so the way that I'm gonna work on, you know, teaching you is we've done much of the small capacity vehicle. We've done much of the foundation vehicle that we did, and if you've practiced already, or if you've already studied Buddhism, you've probably done quite a bit of the small vehicle. So I'm just going to review it in the today and tomorrow. And add a little bit that I didn't talk in the last class. And then we'll move on to the other stages, the other capacities. So just to review, in particular, renunciation. So there are 4 thoughts that turn the mind. And when we're talking about turning the mind, what we're talking about is turning the mind away from this life only, away from sensory pleasures, and creating space in our lives to develop our Dharma minds, or our spiritual capacity. So precious human life, we're going to talk about tomorrow. That's the situation that we are in right now that is so precious that we need to use, because death and impermanence happen. Death happens and our precious human life ends. And so we meditate on death in order to get used to the idea that we need to use this life very well. We need to use it and make it meaningful from the beginning, because we don't know when our death is going to happen, and it's definitely going to happen. And then this idea of impermanence, that things are always changing. And so our situation, even though right now it's very precious and it's wonderful, and we can practice and we can meditate, it's not going to last forever. Many of us are going to have to go back to work, for one thing. And then the suffering of existence is another thought that turns the mind, in the sense of that when we start to recognize that our samsaric existence, when we have ignorance, when we have an existence that is based on this misperception of reality, that sees things as separate, sees things, you know, that encourages the development of these negative emotions, that perpetuates the suffering that we have of sickness, aging, death, not getting what we want, getting what we don't want. You know, all the aspects when we're subject to karma out of our control, that these are uncomfortable situations. And so we use this to be a stepping stone, to be an inspiration, to be a motivation for creating the space in our lives to start to work on our minds, to create a different world for ourselves by working on our minds. And then karma, you know, the fact that if we do negative actions, we experience negative results. And so that becomes, again, a motivation for doing positive actions, so we can create positive results, until we can create the situation in which we can become free of the whole karmic situation that is so out of our control, of how we perpetuate our own suffering. So then the last concept that I want to talk about is renunciation. So this term renunciation, when they were first translating these texts from Tibetan into English, one of the things that they had a lot of religious language within the Christian tradition. Okay, they didn't. Many of them they were German and Russian, I think, were the first countries that studied Tibetan in particular. And it was very interesting. They would not necessarily talk to the people who are actually practicing Tibetan, they would say that the more pure form was the texts, which is kind of crazy because you need the context, you need the people who have the realizations. So renunciation then becomes about definite emergence, which is this determination that I want to definitely emerge from this suffering situation. Now, the term renunciation comes from the, you know, the monastic tradition within the Catholics, where you give everything up, okay, where you reject everything that is not godly, that is somehow worldly, okay, and that really doesn't have the same connotation as definite emergence or renunciation within, which is Neljor, Nejung is the Tibetan word for it. Nejung doesn't have the same connotation as giving everything up. It's actually, it's a sense, renunciation is a sense that our relationship to sense pleasures starts to shift, okay? It doesn't mean that we don't enjoy them anymore. It doesn't mean that we can't have them, that we have to give everything away. Because remember, the Buddha's middle way, his first teaching on the middle way was that it's not about indulging in lots of luxury, and it's also not about giving everything up and going to live in a cave. This is not the ideal. The ideal is, how do I relate to those things that sense pleasures that give me pleasure? And this definite emergence is an understanding that if I only focused on those, then I create suffering for myself. It results in disappointment. It results in loss. It results in me focusing only on what is external and not creating space for what is in my mind. Okay, so renunciation becomes about creating space in our lives to develop lasting happiness. Happiness that lasts longer than just what sense pleasures last, which we know from impermanence that sense pleasures always end. Okay, so that's definite emergence, is this intent, this commitment to work on our minds to develop ourselves spiritually. And this is the basis of that first, that small capacity, because if we do that, if we create virtue in our lives, then we're going to guarantee a future positive rebirth. If we remove the negative aspects in our lives, if we are focusing on benefiting others and doing virtue, avoiding non-virtue, practicing those concentration, selflessness, then we're of course going to create the situation where in our next lives we will continue to be able to have the conditions to develop spiritually. Okay, if you have some questions, we can do that now. We might only have time for fewer questions because I went over in my teaching, so maybe 3 or 4.
Okay, I'm going to start by unmuting Akansha, who had a question from the definitions. So now,
can you hear me?
Yes.
So I have a small question. I'm not sure I understand what cognitive obscurations are, and therefore I'm not able to see the difference between enlightenment and nirvana.
Okay, so cognitive, so you were in the last course, right? Yeah, I remember. So let's see, we talked about that ignorance that is the source of our afflictive emotions, right? Okay, when we're talking about the cause of suffering. And we talked about meditating on the wisdom that starts to see things as not separate from our minds, okay? Or the emptiness or the dependent arising of things. So when we remove that ignorance initially, okay, we stop creating the afflictive emotions. Because if we saw things the way they were, we wouldn't develop attachment, we wouldn't develop anger. So that is our first level of getting rid of the afflictive obscurations. It's also the more what we call gross or obvious level of ignorance that we have removed. And then cognitive, removing the cognitive obscurations is takes it to a more hidden level. And the example they always use is if you put garlic in a cup, okay, let's say you put garlic in a cup, and then you take out the garlic, you still have the scent of garlic in there, right? That's the level of the cognitive obscurations. So that is the stain that still sees things as externally, independently existent, okay? And that even that state, so it's like, okay, something appears to me as independently existent, as separate from my mind out there, okay? And I remove my ignorance, okay? I have an insight into the fact that that's not how things exist, okay? So I don't develop the afflictive emotions, but they still appear to me that way. They still appear to me as inherently existent, even though in my mind, I know they don't exist that way. And that appearing that way is the stain that is still left over, like when you leave the garlic, when the garlic smell is still in the cup, okay? So they appear that way. And I don't actually get rid of that stain of them appearing that way until I achieve the cognitive removal of the cognitive obscuration, where I remove even the stain of things appearing in that way. I start to actually be able to see their relative reality and their ultimate reality at the same time. But only a Buddha can do that. Okay, so that's the cognitive obscuration. It's the obscuration to omniscience.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the best I can do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna move on to Inderjit. You can now ask your question. Hello, Inderjit.
Yeah, hello. Good morning.
Hello.
Good morning. How are you?
Good.
Okay, I couldn't get the exact meaning of is there any difference between nirvana and bodhicitta? As far as I didn't understand it properly, but in my mind I felt that is it is something of same thing that I felt like it is something same, but is there any difference between the two?
Yes, there is a difference. I think the first difference is that bodhicitta is a wish. It is a wish to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. Nirvana is something that you achieve. So it's a goal, okay? Liberation from samsara, freedom from the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death out of our control is what nirvana is. Bodhicitta is the wish to actually go beyond nirvana so that we can become enlightened, so that we can benefit all beings.
Okay, I may say that Buddha got nirvana, and then he as a not as a person or maybe as a person, then he may have this kind of rebirth also because it's he for the benefit of the all. Can I say like this?
Yes, yes. He wouldn't get rebirth out of control. He could choose to manifest what we call manifest in reality for us.
Okay.
So some people say that the Dalai Lama is an enlightened being, that he is choosing to manifest for us what looks like a human being, but actually he is a Buddha.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Now we move on to Abhigyan. I'm going to unmute you. There.
Hi. So my question, am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
My question is, what is your insight on Sadharma Pundrika, which is also called the Lotus Sutra? So to what I have read, it says that the Buddha, after getting up from Vipassana, he started teaching the Lotus Sutra. And he said that we don't really need to get away from our regular life to really attain enlightenment. So I just want to know your view on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we can create, well, I mean, it depends what you mean by regular life. You know, if your regular life is focused only on this life of, you know, house and money and, you know, children and, you know, parties and like that, then I would say that the Buddha probably wouldn't agree with you.
Yeah.
But still having a home, having a family, having a job, and having a bodhicitta motivation, having a dharma practice, then I could see that is shifting your regular life to a life that has a basis in spirituality rather than a basis in materialism.
Okay.
But I don't think you have to give those things up necessarily. It's more of an attitude, a relationship to them.
Okay. So, is the Lotus Sutra is one of the superior teachings, as it was it for the, as we were divided it in three parts, for the regular people, for the greater people. So is Lotus Sutra to be preached by the more wiser people, or how did it work?
I think the Lotus, yeah, I think the Lotus Sutra is part of the Mahayana tradition.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that it was written down originally in Sanskrit, I'm pretty sure, and it's very popular in China.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah. Anything you wanted to add? Sorry.
Just that it would include any of the Tantra. It would be
Okay.
Mahayana. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm muting Kirutika.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
So my question was actually related to karma. So in the previous course, we talked about that karma is beginningless, similar to the mind as well, right? So
yes.
In that case, then, is karma endless? If it is.
Yeah, good question. And we need to ask someone else. My understanding is, if you think about karma in terms of cause and effect, definitely cause and effect continues to exist, and Buddhas are subject to cause and effect, even if they don't have karma, in the sense that karmic seeds are planted on their mind streams that have results later.
Okay, so, but, we also talked about how we can become free of karma, right? If they're enlightened. So in that case, then, how does the mind function if it's free of?
Yeah, free of karma. Yeah, they talk about this spontaneous response to whenever causes are created for them to benefit others, they immediately go there. So it's not a wish, it's not a decision, it's not some kind of free will or dependent, or determinism. It's a spontaneous response to whenever the conditions are created for them to be able to benefit and act in the world, then they do.
Okay.
So in that sense, they wouldn't be carrying any seeds at all. They would just act, and it would always be positive.
Okay. Thank you.
Good question. Should we stop there?
Up to you, Venerable.
Yeah, let's do some meditation.
Okay. So everyone, please go back to a comfortable position. Set your posture once again. Allow your body to become grounded and stable. Letting the bell bring you into the space of the body first. Let's just take a moment to settle down, to relax, to let go of any tension, of any tightness present in the body. And trying to let the body go back to its natural state. Free of tension, free of agitation. Just take a moment to experience that state. Let go of doing and just be with the body as it is, resting. Synchronizing body and mind in a state of calmness. Letting go of everything else. And now letting go of observing the body, physical sensations, we move on to the space of the mind. Contemplate on this meditation on refuge. So in our lives in the past, we've taken refuge in many things. But how many of these things really provided lasting happiness for ourselves? As children, we take refuge in our parents or caregivers. Perhaps you can even recall yourself as a child, an occasion where you fell down and got hurt. You find yourself crying, running to your parents or your caregiver, seeking comfort. Already at that age, we know this is refuge. Take a moment to recall that experience and that feeling of being assisted, of being taken care of being supported, of having someone that you can take as a refuge. By the time we are teenagers, we rebel against our parents and we seek refuge around our friends, feeling that they are the only people who really understand us. They are the ones that we turn to, seeking advice and support. Other times we might take refuge in food. Sometimes we feel that eating is the only way to forget about our problems, especially in times of stress or depression. We may start overeating, especially comfort food like chocolate, ice cream, cheesecake, French fries. And we believe that these things, this food, actually brings us lasting happiness. But is that really the case? Some may take refuge in a healthy diet. We can become completely obsessed with what we eat, making sure that we have the very best ingredients. Things have to be organic, coming from very exotic places, from specific areas of the world, handpicked at the end of the lunar calendar. And we think that maintaining this healthy diet will bring us happiness, that this is the whole source of our well-being. And we take refuge in relationships, believing that this person will make me happy. Sometimes we have a feeling that if only I were able to be with that person, then all the troubles in my life will disappear. But is that really true? Other times we take refuge in music. When we feel sad and blue, we may find some comfort by listening to sad music, perhaps finding relief, feeling that the music of the words help us express our sadness, or knowing that someone else is also experiencing a similar state of mind. They also went through the same things. And it brings us kind of a sense of relief to feel identified in that way. As young adults, we may take refuge in our studies, in school or university. Have you ever defined yourself or evaluated your worth in terms of your grades or exams? Spending a lot of your time and energy, sleepless at night in the library, trying to pass that exam. And sometimes we take refuge in intoxicants like drugs or alcohol. We try to ignore and not deal with the difficulties in our lives. So sometimes we try to drown our problems or soothe the pain by smoking it away. Later in life, as adults, and perhaps reaching a midlife crisis, or upon reaching adulthood, we take refuge in our career, thinking that that is the sole thing that brings purpose to our life. We take refuge in our work, sometimes even going to the extreme of becoming a workaholic. We try to avoid or ignore problems in the family or the relationships by working compulsively, being the first person to arrive at the office and the last to leave. So stop for a moment and ask yourself, how many of those things have brought you true, unchanging, lasting, genuine happiness? How long did the pleasure that we get out of these things last? Consider food, healthy diet, relationships, past friends, intoxicants, music, studies, or job. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, how much happiness has this brought to your life thus far? And these are all ways that we use to end our suffering, but they are only temporary. We have tried all of these things again and again, and still we seem to encounter suffering. We are still not free. Even now we run into problems and difficulties, which create suffering now and in the future. But we don't want to experience suffering anymore. We've had enough. So if we wish to develop a kind heart, a peaceful mind, the only way to do so is to stop looking outside ourselves and to turn our attention inward. A lasting and reliable refuge can only be something that comes from within, something we trust that has the ability to protect and provide us with genuine happiness. Salvation lies within. The only thing that can protect us from suffering, the source of our everlasting, unchanging happiness, lies within our own mind, our own heart. By following the inner path, by following the advice of developing our inner qualities, qualities of wisdom, loving kindness, and compassion, we will achieve the genuine happiness that we seek by turning inward. So imagine the deepest dimension of your own life in the form of a radiating sphere of light at the center of your chest, at the level of your heart. This ball of light at your heart represents your refuge, your inner wisdom, your universal goodness, the source of your present and future happiness. And with this source of refuge from within, we can become a guide, a source of inspiration and support for those around us. So imagine radiating, sending this rays of light from your heart out to the universe with the wish that all the loved ones, friends, whoever you meet in your life, everyone be well and happy. And slowly and gently bringing yourself out of the meditation, becoming aware of your surroundings, your environment. We now move on to the dedication. So as we've been doing thus far, reading from Shantideva's dedication, may all beings everywhere, plagued by the sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored and finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be free from their ailments. Whatever diseases are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain, to dispel the miseries of the world. Maybe so.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.